Yeah.
tell me about where you grew up, your childhood.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bank brat here in Canada, and that my dad worked with the Royal Bank of Canada, and so we kind of, in the same way of army brats, we just moved around from branch to branch as my father kind of continued his climb up the corporate ladder. So we lived in the east coast of Canada, central Canada, the west coast. So yeah, we had a peripatetic kind of upbringing where my brother and I would get uprooted. I don't think like we weren't particularly upset about it. I think
Yeah.
I mean, maybe towards, the teenage years, there was some sense of, oh man,
Yeah.
another new group of friends to make, and being the new kid at school and going through that sort of some hostility from time to time, right? But I think
Definitely.
maybe as a kid of the 80s and 90s, you just to some degree you accepted that that's what it was, and a lot of my friends would had the same thing. They'd be in a town or a city for a couple of years, and then where the hell they go?
Yeah. So
Yep.
this it was an urban upbringing then. You were,
Yeah, it was urban,
yeah,
not rural. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And and that's just the way it was. I feel now very much for my mom, who was a nurse, and so she was able to get a job almost anywhere we went because
yeah,
that was such a valuable commodity as a job. But at the same point, she was uprooted too, and it was my father's career
yeah,
that sort of took precedent. But and that's not the way we are in my household. Obviously, my
yeah,
wife
yeah.
has a really good job, um and for me, I could live anywhere, frankly, as long as it's
Yes.
next to an internet connection. I suppose I'm okay. But yeah, to answer your question, it was an urban, um, pretty idyllic, frankly,
Yeah.
childhood. And some people will ask with horror writers, especially potentially like, you must have had some sort of hellish upbringing in order to,
Yeah.
to have embarked on this career, and a lot of demons to exercise from, bad parenting or something. And while that is probably undoubtedly the case for some writers,
Yeah.
my childhood was nothing but,
Yeah.
frankly, fortunate.
Yeah, yeah. So but it's interesting because I think it plays into this side. I think a horror does have quite a bad reputation, but it's a I think ultimately quite a playful thing. As it does, you don't need to come from depravity in order to kind of
Right.
to. But so you were moving around a lot, and I
Mhm.
assume that as a child, you have to cope with some things, like you said, you change, flux, and all of that, especially at a certain age when you're a boy. And I mean, it's different for girls in subtle ways, but having to socialize, there's a lot of insecurity going on. Like, how did you, I guess, did you manage moving around and changing by kind of escaping into your imagination?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's true. I've said before, the greatest refuge for me whenever we moved was that I knew every city had a library,
Yeah,
often several, and my parents never had a problem dropping me off, on a weekend or weekday or whenever it was. Often it was within walking distance, and so that or the school library,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
the school librarian became like kind of in some cases like a really meaningful part of especially my early existence
yeah, of course.
at a given place, right?
Yeah,
While you're there was one place that you could know there was certain surety to it,
yeah, yeah,
the old couches and the old people often, and
yeah.
the
The quiet.
newspapers threaded
Yeah,
onto dowels, and
yeah,
yeah, it's sort of the bullies or the louts of the town didn't necessarily want to congregate there. They probably avoided it most likely, so it was a sanctuary and a refuge. And
Mm.
that's where I did a lot of my I mean, spent time there,
Yeah, yeah,
which would seem now. I mean, unfortunately, I think in Canada, I'm not quite sure if that this is kind of a worldwide phenomenon, but it's hard to get kids into libraries anymore.
yeah. No, it
It
is.
is seen as somewhat dowdy and outdated, but for me, anyways, yeah, that was it stirred the imagination through the books that I would pick up and read, and obviously fostered me without really knowing it at the time, but it pushed me towards my ultimate career.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, you're mentioning kind of maybe like seeking some kind of refuge. I know that in your books, not in all of them, but thematically, childhood friendships. Did you have a good set of friends when you were at school? Was it difficult to make friends? Did you find it?
I find it's difficult to make friends as you get older and you go, I don't know
Yes.
about you, but
No, it's
or
true. They
or
get
to maintain them. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like now
yeah,
there's suddenly someone you might have known for 20 years shows up with a red Trump hat on, and you're like, oh
Oh,
my God, how
yeah,
do we, how am
yeah,
I going to cope with this, right? I mean, but people change, right? So
they do.
when you're meeting them when they're, you're in elementary school or even high school, I mean, we weren't, I understand now from a, perspective of 50 years, like we weren't even fully formed
No.
people at that point, and then we were sort of learning each other and learning ourselves as we were growing up. So no, I was pretty fortunate to, I think one thing about being someone who moved around a whole bunch, you needed to learn a set
Yeah.
of, I don't know, tactics is probably too
Well, it's
cold a
like a
way of saying it,
chameleon,
but
isn't it? You have to learn to
yeah.
blend in. I mean, I definitely found I moved around a lot as well. I went to
Mm,
so many different schools and have worked so many different types of jobs as well. And I found that, especially as I felt like an outsider a lot when I was younger. And I think that when you're kind of, yeah, you the tactics that you're describing for me at least was adapting as a kind of way of going, I know how to read you, or I know I can see what you like, and oh, do you like what like a lot of it's a hyper vigilance in a way, right? But it's not a bad
mhm.
thing. And when you're a child, yeah, you're not fully formed, and but a lot of these children at school, what's difficult, I think, is that people pretend that they know, so
Right.
everyone's pretending all the time. And I wanted to ask, like, so if you've got this existence where you're happy with your books and that's a kind of constant, at what point does it evolve into you kind of I guess like making your own imagination a real thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think I became more committed to it. I was at a very technical high school. It just happened to be, again, we moved there and the other high schools were all full. There was nowhere else for me to get in. And then so me and my brother went to something. It was more like auto shop and
Yeah, yeah,
it sort of had a real technical focus. But so I was, at that point, I wasn't even sure what I wanted to be. But we had this one English teacher who set up what I think was in the city and at the weirdest place, a technical school, the first sort of upper level creative writing program.
wow.
So it was just a class. And I was such a terrible student, Nigo. I have to like, I mean, I really couldn't care less. I was bad at just about everything.
Yeah,
I think I was just unfocused, I think it was
yeah,
like a car that was stuck in neutral and you were just waiting for the thing that would energize you to drop it into drive. I look at it that way now.
yeah, yeah.
But at the time, I think most of my teachers, fairly so, were like, oh God, I'm going to be looking up at this guy or looking down at this guy from like an oil change pit at some point as I drive my car over him, and that's which again is not a terrible job by any stretch of the
No.
imagination, but in any case, this there wasn't a lot of thought, I don't think, amongst the teachers for good reason that Craig Davidson was going to amount to very much. But this one teacher, I wrote a couple stories for her, and as I recall the conversation, she kind of came up to me and go, like, Craig, I'm as surprised that anyone would be saying this, but these are pretty good,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm as shocked as you are probably. But she ended up buying me a copy of the Writer's Digest, which was, again, I'm dating myself, but it was a big yellow book
Yeah,
that
yeah,
like
I've heard of
here
it.
are all the places that you could send your work to, essentially. Um, and so that kind of consideration and encouragement was super meaningful to me,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
probably was what started me down the path. But I've always said, into my early 20s and mid 20s, even like there were times when I was living so close to the bone where I
yeah,
was like, God, I wish Miss Jeffries had just said, you suck at this and you should do something else,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because there were periods where pursuing that dream, I was really not sure I was gonna prevail, right? So I mean, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that's most people's story too. You'll find a couple people, maybe you've spoken to them, where they just, oh, I'll write a book, and they wrote it and it's a huge success.
yeah.
Most of us don't go that way. Most of us
No.
have a it takes a while to get that first success, and then that first success is not necessarily followed by another success for quite some time.
Totally. Yes, the world is very competitive as well. And you're incredibly prolific. But that first validation seems very important because obviously you've had, like, you'll have had lots of moments of validation through your career, like obviously because you've had a lot of success. But do you think that first, just that someone just paying you some attention and making you feel special, does that still stay with you? Like, strongly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anything, I'll sit down with friends of mine who are still, we've been writing maybe for, I guess, professionally for 20 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And one of the sad, this is not, maybe sad's too strong of a word for it, but it's like what's probably like a drug addict. Like that first hit,
Totally.
it doesn't even have to be very much, but the power of the
Mm,
high is like something you're probably chasing for the rest of your life. The first story I sold was for I think $10.
yeah.
But the I could sell something for $100,000 now and be like,
Yeah.
oh, good, we can
Yeah.
we can help send the kids to school or
Mm,
this that or the other. But like that pure hit of adrenaline and endorphin that comes from those first couple, you're
yeah.
selling your first book or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something you're probably chasing at some level for the rest of your career to strangely, and I'm not trying to be bleak or anything, but to diminishing returns only because you know what I mean. It's
I
like
do. I
you've
do.
learned how to bounce that ball, and it's great, and you're excited and happy to be able to bounce that ball. But it's
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
have been bouncing this ball for a while, sort of a thing. So yeah, no, those first ones, like those were the ones. That's what created the
Mm.
lifelong, I think, fascination and pursuit.
No, totally. I mean, now we've kind of technology has kind of weaponized that sense of being accepted with social media and stuff. Obviously, that's playing on pretty much the same thing. And it's interesting on social media. You also get this thing where you're obviously looking for more followers, more likes, and it is like accumulating money, like accumulating anything. It is the purity kind of goes, and you get used to it, which is a shame. But I guess with being like a creative, what is good is that when you're writing your work, like every one of them is an adventure, every one of your books. So you're kind of always in a way that kind of drive to get back to that feeling is fueling you wanting to get better, right? So were you doing that throughout your 20s? Were you just like hustling, writing and like really leaning into that passion for the most part, apart from maybe a couple of wobbles?
Yeah, yeah, I think I was working, whatever odd jobs I could do. And if I ever got enough, like if I sold a big story or a magazine article or anything, and I saw, okay, I got whatever, $8,000, $5,000. I'm like, I think I can quit now and,
Yeah.
and, and work for 2 months, 3 months, and then
Yeah,
I'll just
yeah,
get another job sort of a thing, which seems to be not uncommon. At that age, and I was doing some schooling as well, so it was like sort of peripatetic, but always was at the front of the mind was sort of, and I was getting rejected,
yeah,
like
of course.
I think my story is that I would short stories I started with, which I think a lot of people do. I couldn't get arrested. I could not sell a story for love nor money.
Yeah,
I This is back in the day when you would send off a self-addressed stamped envelope and you'd
yeah,
wait by the mailbox for the mailman to come and deliver
yeah,
your failures back to you,
yeah,
which he or she did regularly, probably until I was about 26, 27. And then it was like the floodgates open. I think I sold like 5 or 6 stories in a row. And that became my first story collection under my own name. And then they signed me to a novel. And so I thought, okay, great. Now, here I am in my late 20s. I guess I'll be a writer for the rest of my life. It took a while, but that's not the way it went for me. Those first couple came out, they didn't make any real kind of a splash. And I was back working at a library. I was back driving a school bus.
wow,
So that's just sort of my path,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't. It's not particularly strange either, right?
No, no,
It's
no.
yeah. So yeah. But I think what was always driving it was that kind of the rush that you get when you it's not just an acceptance. I think it's probably deeper than that. I think that for me, and I think for most writers, is you've shared something with someone else who has found something in it
Mm.
that they find emotionally appealing, or I don't know, intellectually appealing or
Yeah.
scary or whatever it is. And you've held palaver with them, and you've shared something with them in that way, which is obviously really meaningful. And that's probably the hit that really keeps you coming back more than the money or anything else, because there's easier ways to make a living.
Yeah, totally. It's I think reading especially is a co-creation because as a writer you're kind of directing how someone is taking in your story, and obviously everyone's reading it differently, everyone's seeing the faces differently,
Mhm.
and relating to things differently. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's such a layered thing between an artist, creative, whatever you want to call yourself, and the reader. So when you started hitting your stride, you weren't initially writing horror, were you? Or like
Well, there
when you
was a,
your first book that was published as
it
Craig.
really depends on how deep you go
Yeah.
into the lore, I guess, into the arcana. My first books actually were published under a different pen name, to a press in America called Necro, sadly no longer around, but known as the home of hardcore horror, who would have published Ed Lee,
Yeah, yeah,
um, and others, Sir Charlie Jacob, Gerald. Oh, I don't know how to say his last name, but
yeah.
yeah, so people who were like, I think, well known within that sort of, I think, really interesting subset of horror. But I had written this novel, and I reached out to the guy, and actually reached out under my pen name. I
Yeah.
created a an email address.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had no idea how to work this stuff. I should have just said, "My name's Craig, but I'm writing under this pen name." But then he's like, "Well, great, I'll take this." And then he sent me a check made out to my pen name. So I couldn't catch it. I essentially had to like come clean and say, "Dude, appreciate it. I This is a complicated shell game here, but my real name's Craig." And so anyway, we got past that impasse. But yeah, the first books that I published were yeah, probably in my mid-20s, and they were
Oh,
under a pen name. But again, then there was time went by before I published a collection and a novel under my own name. And
yeah.
then, yeah, and then some more time went by before I sort of embarked on this career as Nick Cutter.
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to wind back a bit to, so if horror was the thing you were gravitating towards, I'm presuming then you would horror had it wasn't just like, oh well, this has got an audience. You must have loved
Right.
the
Let's make a
genre.
quick buck here.
Yeah,
Yeah. No,
exactly. But I mean,
right.
that is
Right.
that
Yeah.
is the plus side of horror, though, to be fair. But you must have also enjoyed horror when you were younger as well.
Yeah. You're totally right. I mean, it's very clear, I think, in my work as Cutter that Stephen King, Clive Barker,
Yeah.
Robert R. McCammon, uh, William Golding, obviously
Yeah.
not a horror writer, but
I know.
my influences are pretty clear, and I think quite obvious. But the mainly on the horror side, yeah. When I was in those libraries as a teenager, I mean, I was reading, or preteen, I was reading horror, and I probably came to it a lot earlier than maybe I should have, in terms of my nightmares and my
Yeah.
sleepless nights, but in terms of how it must have activated my brain at that age, and that had a sustained effect. Clearly, I came to it at the right time. And the truth is that I did a master's program in creative writing, and at the time in Canada and probably almost anywhere, again dating myself, if I had said I wanted to write a horror book, they would have said that's not why you're here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we don't support that kind of writing. You've got to write a real
Yeah.
good Canadian literary novel
Not
here.
genre fiction. Yeah.
Right, not
Yeah.
genre fictional, and
Yeah.
I believe that has changed a great deal, thank goodness.
Mm.
But at the time, that was sort of so. I wrote a Canadian short story collection, which was still, I think, pretty edgy is the wrong word, but it was pretty violent and visceral. But at the
Yeah.
same point, fit more in line with the sort of thing that they would like to affix a master's degree to. Yeah, and that ended up getting picked up, and then I sort of explained that early part of my career. But I'd always, in my heart and in my head, thought, listen, I'm gonna find a way to write a horror book. Um, and to explain that, I was living here in Toronto with my fiance years ago, and we went to the Royal Ontario Museum, and they had this a kind of traveling showcase on water, how we use water as human beings. And there was this little film projection thing over an alcove playing, and I wandered over there, and my wife, wife to be, eventually had to come over and like, Craig, what are you doing back here? You disappeared. And it was this film loop of a tapeworm, sort of
Right.
blown up really big,
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
like microscopically ballooned out, and I was just fascinated by it. And I sort of, obviously I knew what tapeworms were, but I'd never really thought much, taken much time to really think about them and how weirdly beautiful they were, but also how like deadly they were. and that came on the heels of me writing a book called Cataract City, under my own name, which the first part of that was two boys lost in the woods.
Yep.
And it kind of, these two things sort of smashed together, the idea of like really liking that time in a kid's life,
Yeah.
and yeah, these crazy tapeworms, and that you know created the book that I'm most known for, which is The Troop, obviously.
Yeah. It's and it's God, it's such a good book. I mean, and it's also a gateway. I think. Well, I've observed it to be a gateway for a lot of people into horror. I've seen people, or maybe a more extreme is the wrong word because we have now have a thing called extreme horror, which
Right.
obviously like which is crazy. But yeah, it's people. I guess it's like that kind of classic horror, but with you said an edge, but it's something else, something more visceral. And I want to ask you about you mentioned like you would be having nightmares because you were reading horror maybe, but there was something that it did to your brain that made you kind of want to pursue it, partly because you loved it, you enjoyed it. But what is it about your work, I mean, generally, that kind of scares you when you're writing something? Are you writing about a fear? And I'm not talking about like a fear of tapeworms, because obviously you said that that's
Mhm.
quite beautiful, but like that thing of children in a kind of on that precipice of being innocent and then not innocent, and working out the social dynamics, because like I know that's like a bit in the Queen as well, so it's like
Mhm.
what is it in those stories apart from the monster which is scary to you?
Man, I think it's because you can never know what's going to scare somebody. And some of the some of the things that scare other people don't scare me, and some
Yeah,
of the things that petrify me roll right off somebody else's shoulders. So there's no real universal. I mean, I think maybe death and dying at some, but even some people oddly aren't really completely scared of that. So yeah, there's no universal fear that you as a horror writer can sort of burrow down on. So I think for me, it's God, that's a great question, and it's. I wish I had a more elegant answer for you. I think with all the books, whether it's Davidson or Cutter, it starts from a place of finding these characters who I feel that I can follow at some level, and I can invest myself for the period of time in which I'm writing the book in their lives and their worldview as best as I can. Um, and the sort of scary stuff. I mean, again, I'm always surprised, frankly, sometimes an ego is like, oh, that scared me. I'm like, oh, well, good. I'm glad because I'm not, sitting there biting my fingernails as I'm writing it.
no, because
I'm,
you're
uh,
inching through it,
I
aren't
guess
you?
so.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of the orchestrator of it.
yeah,
And I'm very pleased, obviously, because I really do think that's, I don't know, a hallmark of horror writing and something that you strive to do, obviously. And sometimes, like, there are films especially that sort of like how do I say this? Like they're sort of like we might not be able to scare you, so it'll be kind of funny. So you'll like that part of it too. And
yeah,
and don't get me wrong, I like those movies too. I really enjoy them, and I've had great fun at those. But I think the danger, the fear, even of from a horror creator's perspective, is like that people are just not going to be scared, right?
yeah,
But unless you're really earnest about I think the attempt to try to scare them, you're
yeah.
probably not going to get there. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like I feel like
totally.
a movie like Hereditary or The Exorcist, or like they're like no fucking around.
No,
We
it's
are
there.
trying to scare you. Like and maybe it's not going to work. Maybe you're going to laugh at the screen, but the attempt is there to like in earnest and with all due seriousness try and scare the hell out of you.
Yeah, totally.
And
Yeah. Sorry, go on, go on.
no, yeah, no. And so that's generally my again, it's not, there's no humor in it necessarily. There's no, it's kind of earnest. It's an earnest attempt to scare you with the understanding that maybe it just ain't gonna, turn your fear switch.
Yeah, and I think though it's also like it's an emotional honesty and like being honest, like you said, you're trying to write characters that you're going to get the readers and you can get behind for a whole novel, and obviously you've got to be real and you've got to speak some truth, which is about being earnest. You've got to. I think the best horror for me is always stuff which lays it out in a real way. And like you said, there are tactics, of course, of like, a bit of comedy to take the edge off this. But if you're just straight up with it, that's definitely my favorite stuff. And I think your writing in general is pretty classic. Like you have I mean, I refer to them as tropes, but like they're,
Mhm.
like the kids lost on an island, or the deep of like, that's like these are all like formulas that we all really understand. So that
Absolutely.
helps.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And I think like, isolation is just the key one. I think that I find I go back to, but it's so classic, right? It's
Mm,
if you isolate these characters, then it is a character tactic as well,
yeah,
because um what you may do in a city, or within a society with rules and governance is a lot different than how we may react, when those sort of
yeah.
safe guide rails are sort of hacked away, and we're all
Mm,
sort of dealing with these things on Earth. So isolation. I mean, that's one of the clearest tactics in a horror creator's bag.
yes,
You know what I mean?
yes.
That's why
No
the
mobile
that's
reception,
why
no cell
the
service.
exactly. That's why the teenager goes back up the stairs in the spooky house instead of outside and runs away. It's like
Totally.
sometimes it's ridiculous how hard you have to work to like, God, how do I, especially with modern technology, right? How
Yeah,
do we? Nope, sorry, they only have rotary phones in this entire town for some reason, and yeah, there's a big cloud over the cell phone tower. So
yeah,
in any case, yeah, yeah, and it's fun to play with those things.
yeah.
And I've never really thought, um, I mean, there's so few books that I've read, and this is no shade on anybody, but like I try to think of the horror books that I've read that have been like, this has no precedent to me. Like I cannot see. I think the closest I ever came was House of Leaves, that felt like it was written from a Borgian sort of dream state,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
everything else that I've read, even the ones that I love a great deal, and maybe part of the reason because I love them a great deal is because like, yeah, you can see their antecedents,
Totally.
Frankenstein here, or
Yeah,
Dracula
yeah.
here, obviously, or and that's fine.
Well,
You sort of play
it's
with tropes that have already been around, and
it's good from I mean it's good from a marketing point of view because I think people like consuming things that they've already consumed. We like going back to the place that made us feel good, but we don't want to go back to the same place. So and horror is, it's about the community aspect of it, all part of loving the genre is loving all the nooks and crannies as well. So
yes,
you're writing, if you're a fan, it's not like you're going, right, here's my business plan for this book, this is the trope I'm going to use, this is it. It's just
right.
what feels like comfy to you. And I think like what's I mean, just like we're gonna end soonish, and I just want to ask, because you've obviously, I think the troop is being made into a film, is that right, or is it being developed at the
It
moment?
has been in what would be called development hell for quite some time, as are some other. Maybe I shouldn't say development hell. That's like I'm a
No,
production
no, I,
exec.
I
Like I
work in
really know what
TV,
that
so
means,
I
even.
understand. I understand
Okay,
all of
you
it. So
okay?
it's like, yeah,
So, it has gone through several scripts, and I mean, you having read it in Ego, like it's not an easy.
no, it would be an
I've
introduction.
been
Yeah,
right. It's like it's essentially it's kids dying, which is on
yeah.
its own is a tough nut to crack, or something in the flyover states that they might not be too pleased by. So I'm kind of amazed by how much continued interest there has been in developing into a film, and it's passed through different hands, but it's in some very capable hands right now. So I'm obviously hopeful, but yeah, nothing for sure, but obviously hopeful.
What do you think about the fact that horror films are so popular and horror fiction? And I know there's not as, readership of books in general is not as big as people who watch movies, but it still feels like since I mean, I would say people like you are kind of an exception. Like in general, since the 90s, horror fiction is kind of, I mean, it's got a great culture and great fan base, but in terms of a popular appeal that might translate from a book to an adaptation into a movie or a TV series, like considering how popular like
Mhm.
horror movies are, what do you think is like maybe a sticking point for the growth of like horror as a fiction?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, and definitely some of the crossover, I think, difficulty might be is that like a lot of the great creators on the film side do it all. Like
Yeah,
they don't need a piece of IP. Zach Krager doesn't need a piece of IP.
yeah,
Um, Ari Aster doesn't need a
yeah.
piece of IP. A great deal of them work from their own ideas, and so the script comes from them. And so there's like, yeah, there might be really great horror novels floating around. But they don't, you know, the really, I think some of the top level creatives in the field are just not accessing them because they really don't need to. They have their own ideas. And past that, you know, I think you're probably right in that I think it's, and I think, you know, it is. I wouldn't say, some people have told me before it's having a moment. I feel like, as you've said, it's horror is always sort of somewhat maligned, but yet always sort of popular and part of the zeitgeist because it
Yeah,
captures the zeitgeist so well. Even sort of accidentally, it can kind of capture the
definitely.
zeitgeist. Um, so like, and I think right now, like, if you're saying if the idea is it's having a moment, I think it's having a moment because you know, for lack of a better word, when I was younger, it's pretty hard to get a book that was written by someone who wasn't just a white dude.
Totally.
You know, and they were great. I like them, you know, but I think now there's a lot more diversity in horror. There's a lot more stories that are coming from places that maybe, you know, publishers weren't as keen
Yep.
on investigating before, and you know, to their detriment, I think. So that probably is
Yeah, yeah.
making horror bigger and not only sustaining it, but I think I don't know, I mean, not just
Yeah,
diversifying it in the sense of like the creatives
I get
who
it.
are
Yeah.
now commenting on it, but yeah, you're right. Like the voices have made it a real more interesting genre than maybe it was priorly.
Add to that, the world is fucked. So it's kind of like it was always good. And horror always seems to kind of rear its head in a different way. And also,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
but also, like you said, I mean, I've always thought of horror as being quite, it attracts outsiders. And obviously, these communities that you're talking about that didn't have access. I mean, I would love the idea of horror not being a scary thing, but a thing where you can create with passion and love. You know, it's like
Mhm.
it's not just for white guys with long hair and black clothes. Like, you know what I mean? Like, which let's be honest, it probably, if you said, you know, if you said, think of someone who reads horror, that's what someone's going to think of, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and it's for them and for us, and you know, but it's for, you know, it feels larger now, I
It
think,
does.
than even when I first started writing, and definitely from when I started reading way back in the day. So, um, yeah, yeah, I think that's a great question, and but you're right. So your sense is that it's actually maybe I misheard you, but like that there is some sort of impasse between horror fiction getting larger, or there's some kind of
I just,
restrictor plate on it.
I don't know. I think it's I think it's very complicated, but ultimately, you know, we got horror from fiction. I mean, you know, like Frankenstein,
Mhm.
Dracula, like, you know, and I feel like horror often gets like those things have kind of been pillaged as like gothic literature. And I think that, you know, if there are popular movies made like Hellraiser, for example, like
Mhm.
that, you don't people don't know about Clive Barker. They might know about Hellraiser. They probably don't know about Clive Barker and so. And I just think that there's horror fiction for me is such a pure form of horror. I love cinema, but for me, I make the best movie in my head when I'm reading. You know, so it's
Right.
like, you know, but no, I don't have a strong opinion. I mean, of like why it's not.
Mhm.
I just would I think it's such a rich genre, and I would just like to see it flourish more.
Yeah, and definitely, you know, you know, when they, you know, a bird box or it wasn't cabinet, you know, Paul
Yeah,
Tremblay's Knock
yeah,
at the
yeah,
Cabin,
yeah,
as
yeah.
it became, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, the idea of during that period of time, books getting adapted and making a really, you know, brilliant transition to being classics on the page and also classics cinematically. That you're right. On that level, it seems maybe there are less that make that kind of seamless transition to being sort of classics in both spheres.
yeah,
Again, I chalk that up to just the creatives.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Having their own sort of autonomy and just like, yeah, no, I've got an idea and I'm just going to work with that sort of a thing. So, but hope springs eternal.